I really enjoyed the Veilguard, but you simply have your head in the sand if you think it's of the same narrative quality as Origins or Mass Effect. This is most likely due to the massive amounts of talent that have left BioWare when EA forced it to become something it's not. And due to those departures, BioWare isn't what it once was, so why is it trying to make what it once did? This doesn't mean BioWare is now a talentless studio. In fact, something they were once abysmal at has only improved in the last decade: their combat. In the olden days of Baldur's Gate and Knights of the Old Republic, story and player choice were at the forefront of BioWare's games. Even today, the dense narrative of these titles is something to behold. In contrast, the gameplay of these titles is horrendous by modern standards. It's clunky, visually boring, and relies entirely around cooldowns and random chance, instead of positioning and damage output. Skipping ahead a few decades, for all the drama that surrounded Anthem, the combat was received favourably by players and critics. The fluidity of the movement and Iron Man encapsulating feel of the gameplay was one of the most highly praised aspects of the title. Moving on to the Veilguard, it seems that the storytelling has been the most heavily criticised, specifically the lack of choices present in the game. Veilguard's narrative is almost completely linear, with minimal choices that affect any major outcomes of quests. This is in stark contrast to Origins, which required an entire third-party website that took a significant amount of time to fill out in order to import all the far-reaching decisions present in the game. But for as large a gap in quality between the narrative elements of these two installments are, there's an even larger divide in the quality of their combat. Veilguard's combat is cinematic, highly customizable, visually impressive, and extremely engaging. In comparison, Origins' combat can feel rather stale. Most of the skill comes from keeping your character equipped with good gear and waiting for your cooldowns to end. It feels like as BioWare's stories have gotten less impressive, their combat has only gotten better. I would say the intersecting point where both were at their height would be Mass Effect 1, as it still had a fair amount of depth in role-playing elements. Whereas the sequels shifted more towards action games, though the popular consensus is probably that Mass Effect 2 was the best balance BioWare ever achieved. Which leads me to my initial statement. BioWare should move away from RPGs and instead focus on making impressive action games. I feel as though Veilguard is like a God of War game that's spread too thin. Where Santa Monica was able to focus on telling one story and perfecting two weapons to a sublime quality, Veilguard pulls itself in too many directions and ends up being a master of none. Now, this applies to every RPG, but the reason I think it's prudent for BioWare to move away from RPGs is because they've lost their main strength. See, every major Western RPG developer offers something different. Bethesda creates open-ended worlds for you to immerse yourself in and conquer. Obsidian has incredibly sharp writing that absorbs the player into every quest. And BioWare had the toughest decisions you could make in gaming, and they've ceded that ground to CD Projekt and Larian, meaning BioWare no longer has a niche to fill in the RPG genre, and they're fighting a losing battle. Anthem has already proven that they're capable of making a great action combat system, and I'm sure if it was single player it would have been received much better. What's more is that, and you may not believe me, but open world non-RPG fantasy games are almost non-existent in the current gaming climate. Seriously, the only one I can think of is Breath of the Wild, and there are still people that would argue that is an RPG. What's more is that the Veilguard's main plot on its own has some really strong moments. The first act is certainly paced far too slowly, but everything from Weishaupt on is a solid fantasy epic, and the finale is only surpassed by the suicide mission in terms of the studio's previous endings. The main criticism against it is that it sells itself as a game where you can choose your own adventure, but the choices you make with any impact are few and far between. If they were able to focus on telling a solid linear narrative with a more focused combat system, I think they could easily carve out a niche for themselves in the open world genre. They already have relevant experience working outside of RPGs, and EA isn't trying to chase the live service train anymore now that Apex Legends is raking in the cash. The truth is, the BioWare of old is gone, as all of the leaders and key creatives have left the studio to make their own games. And the people left, while talented, will always be compared to what came before, After all, as much as the general play is concerned, it's the exact same team that made Dragon Age Origins, because they're still called BioWare. But this new studio isn't BioWare, and instead of trying to recapture a legacy they can't live up to, I think pivoting to carve out a new niche would be the best thing for the studio. I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, if you want to see how CD Projekt stole BioWare's crown of having the toughest choices in gaming, click here.